welcome to Muddy Beards 4x4. I am Robbie, and today we are going to be talking all about the NP241 rock Trac transfer case swap that I'm going to be doing in my 1999 Jeep Cherokee XJ that I call the Trail Plug. Now my goal by the end of this video is to have a complete 100% guide on how to do this swap with all the little details. Now this really is a pretty straightforward swap, but combing through all the forums, trying to figure out all the little details, I want everything right here in one video. That being said, if you have any experience or if you've done this and you have some knowledge on this swap, I'd actually really appreciate you putting it down into the comment section below. That way anybody else could go down and reference, making this video truly a one-stop spot for all information about this transfer case swap. So go ahead and put your comments down below as we go through the video. So let's get started, and let's first talk about why you would want to do this swap. So right here I have an NP241J transfer case compared to my stock NP231 that came in my Cherokee from the factory. And as you can see, the 241 is a physically larger case. And it has this extra ribbing or gusseting that just simply make this a physically stronger case. Now internally, it's the same thing. Inside, we have slightly larger planetary gears, and even that whole chain and gear assembly is larger, making these things pretty darn stout. In fact, I've seen lots of guys who have these things installed behind V8s, and they hold up pretty darn well for being a factory style transfer case. Now beyond that, the other cool thing is that these have the same 6-bolt mounting pattern and 29 spline input, pretty much all Jeeps from this generation, making this swappable into TJ Wranglers, XJs, ZJ Grand Cherokees, even WJs, and of course also the JK model Wrangler Jeeps. I think the only Jeep from that generation might be the older XJs, like the Renix XJs, I think have a different input spline count, so you might need to look into that. But this is really cool because it's directly bolt on to pretty much all of the Jeeps from these generations. The other really cool feature from the 241 is that they have a fixed yoke rear output straight from the factory. So you don't have to worry about splitting open the case or doing a slip yoke eliminator like you would have to do on the 231, the stock transfer case. Now lastly, and probably the biggest reason why you want to do this swap, is that the NP241 has a 4-to-1 low range compared to the 2.7-to-2 that the NP231 has. Now that amount of a gear reduction in the NP241 is going to make this thing just perform so much better off-road. That amount of gear reduction is going to make this thing a lot more controllable and stable on the rocks, especially when you have a manual transmission like I do. So what we have here is pretty much a bolt-up ready, stronger, fixed-yoked, factory 4-to-1 ratio transfer case. What is not to want about this swap? So where can you find one of these transfer cases? Now there were 2 generations of these transfer cases made, and they are basically the same thing except for one major difference which may determine which one of these you want to source. So the first ones were the 2003 to 2006 Jeep Wrangler TJ Rubicon edition only. Now these were known as the 241 OR, but they also made these transfer cases in the Jeep JK series throughout basically the entire model run of 2007 to 2018. But again, remember, Rubicon edition only. Now for the most part they are basically the same thing, except for on the earlier model ones, so the 241 ORs out of the TJ Wranglers, they had the provisions to be able to plug in your factory speedometer hookups in the rear output of the transfer cases. The earlier model Jeeps, that is where the speedometer hooked up like my factory 231 has here. However, in the JKs, in the later model Jeeps, they moved that down to a wheel sensor, and so there are going to be no provisions to be able to plug in your factory speedometer if you're swapping it into an earlier model Jeep. Now for me, that means I can't have a speedometer, but you know, my XJ is going to be a trailer queen and pretty much a rock crawler only, and so I'm not too worried about that. But if that is something that matters to you, you're going to want to source one from one of the earlier model TJ Wranglers from 03 to 2006. So once again, while this thing is really a fairly straightforward bolt-on swap, there's still a couple details that you're going to want to consider before you can start this swap. Now some of these are mandatory, you're going to have to address it before you can make this swap, and some of them are sort of optional. But let's talk about this a little bit. Number one is kind of a simple thing, but it's one of those things that if you want to do a complete swap, you want it to work. So right here we have the sensor for the input for the 4x4 indicator light that shows up on your dash. Now if you're bolting this into a JK, you should be able to plug your electronics right into this and that'll work. But if you want this to work on an earlier model Jeep like my XJ Cherokee, you are going to have to get a different sensor and screw that in. Now I managed to find an old forum that had the listing for a couple Dorman parts here. I went ahead and bought those and confirmed, I mean this bolts right in, and that'll take place for this sensor. And then you do have to buy the pigtail as well that goes with it that you can splice into your factory wiring harness, and you can plug that in, and then your 4x4 indicator light will work on the dash. So you don't have to do that, but you can. I think both of these parts were like 12 bucks each-ish, so if that matters to you, you can go find them. I will leave a link in the description below of where I got those on Amazon so that you can easily source them. Now the other thing to think about is your linkage. So one of the biggest differences between these cases and the factory cases in the earlier model Jeeps is that the shifter arm or the shifter lever or shifter blade, whatever you want to call it, is opposite of the ones that are from your Jeep. Meaning that this one shifts into gear by pushing it back. Whereas the like the stock 231, it actually goes down, it's reversed. So in order to make your factory gate and your factory lever work, you're going to have to do something with the linkage. Now this was something that I struggled to find a ton of information on. Some of the people on the old forums were like, you know, I bought a AZ design, like solid linkage kit, something like that, aftermarket one, and modified it to make it work, or something like that. But I actually bought this. Wasn't cheap, but this is a cable shifter from Novat Conversions, and it's actually specifically made to do this swap, to take a factory, you know, XJ or TJ, that generation of Jeep, and be able to swap in a 241. So it comes with all the brackets and all that stuff just to make them swap nice and simple with something that's reliable and strong like a cable shifter. Now the only difference here that you have to worry about if you have a JK case like I do is if you notice the shifter arm on these has a stud rather than just an opening that you can bolt through. The TJ models, you should just be able to hook this cable right up to it, no problem. I'm probably going to have to cut off that stud and then drill it out. I can bolt up this linkage through that shifter arm. So we are going to have to modify that slightly with the JK setup. With the TJ, again, it should be directly bolt on. So that takes care of the linkage. The last thing we should consider is the yokes. So these 241s, again, come with a fixed yoke in the rear, but the rear yoke on at least the JK models is this sort of a weird ball and cup CD style kind of yoke, and I don't want to use that. And the front yoke is a 1310. Which is a small U-joint. Now, this is all part of a big like 1-ton axle swap process that I'm doing in this build, and so I want to have the same size U-joint on all ends of my driveline, and I want big strong U-joints. So I want to upgrade these things to a 1350. Now there are yokes available online for 241s. I went ahead and just kind of got some generic, I believe they're a 32 spline output, and I found these 1350 yokes which appear to be able to work. I do have it bolted up to the front already here. However, there is one thing that we should consider. Both of these yokes have a counter bore, and they use this little O-ring to kind of seal up to prevent any fluid leaking past the splines. These aftermarket yokes that I bought do not have that counter bore, and so therefore I will not be able to install that O-ring. Now, I've never had any issues with these leaking if you just put on some like plumber's pipe sealant and stuff on the threads and go ahead and install it. And so that's what I'm going to do and hope that it doesn't leak. Now on the front, there's a couple things to notice here. This 1350 is so big that when you spin it, it barely clears that shifter arm, and both for low and for high, it'll clear. But when we put it back into two-wheel drive, it actually would hit. Now thankfully this thing doesn't spin two-wheel drive, so we shouldn't have to worry about that, but if the yoke's not in the perfect position, it's not going to shift back into two-wheel drive. So it might be one of those things where I kind of have to move a little bit and adjust the Jeep in order to get into two-wheel drive. That's a nuisance. I don't like that. So you might have to modify that front shift lever or shifter blade, whatever you want to call it, a little bit in order to make it clear. But that's something to consider. I'm not super worried about it because it does look like it's going to clear in four-wheel drive, so we shouldn't have too much of a problem. Now, the stock rear yoke also is a little bit different than this aftermarket yoke is. Obviously, again, like I said, this is sort of like this ball and cup CV style yoke. And they also have these pressed on dust shields to just help keep some extra debris out of that output seal. And again, it's just like the front one, it is counterboard to accept that O-ring. So this one doesn't have those provisions, but again, I think I'm going to be able to get away with just putting some plumbers, pipe sealant on the threads and bolting this in. Now there is a company that actually makes yokes that I think are specifically for the NP241 rock track. It's JB Conversions. They even have the little dust shield, and they actually are counterboard to put the little O-ring in and all that stuff, but there's never in stock. Every time I went to go buy one, it was always out of stock for like the last year. So I don't know if that's something that they just don't make anymore, or if I should have just called and seen if they could have made one. But I think these generic yokes should work. I will leave a link in the description below where I found these. But I would also go check out JB Conversions website and see if you can find the ones that are specifically made for this transfer case. Now there's one last thing though that I wanted to bring up if you are going to upgrade your yokes, especially if you're going to move to a larger yoke. So the diameter of these yokes are going to be different. This 1351 is a lot thicker, which means that I had to go ahead and change the seal. Okay, so the sealing surface is going to be a different size. I believe this aftermarket yoke is 2.125 or 2 1/8, and it was just too big for the stock seal. So I went to a company called, I think it was Dr. Driveline. I went to their website, and you can just type in the parameters. The outside diameter on this transfer case was 2.75, so 2 3/4. And then the interior diameter, or the ID of the seal, was 2.125 or 2 1/8. And so I was ordered to order one, Timken's, good seals, and so I just swapped the seals so that I could use these yokes. So now that I got my parts all located and sourced, and my transfer case, I'm ready to start the installation. Now before I can go ahead and get this thing bolted up, I'm going to go ahead and swap out all these parts. I'm going to get my 4x4 indicator light sensor put in. I'm going to go ahead and get my yokes installed for good and tightened down. And I got to drill out the shifter arm here, blade and stuff before I put on that front yoke. And then I think I'm going to go ahead and get all my, my linkage stuff installed first too, because it's going to be a lot easier when there's no transfer case up underneath there to do that. But once I got all of that done, I'm going to go ahead and get this thing fitted up in place and find out just how easy it is to bolt this thing right up. Well, check it out, everyone. The transfer case is in. I don't know how much I caught on camera of me fumbling around trying to get this thing in by myself, but I found it just really easy just to lower the whole transmission down and just kind of pick it up and put it in. It's a lot easier to do by myself than trying to manage a jack that's not made to actually hold a transfer case. Now, it did take me only a second to realize that this thing looks like it has a slightly different clocking pattern on the mounting bolts, and so I looked it up, and sure enough, that's the case. Wrangler model Jeeps had a different clocking pattern than, say, the XJs did. In fact, the front output side is actually angled slightly down. Now, for me, that actually ended up working out a little bit because this is such a bigger bodied transfer case. I think that if it was mounted more horizontally, like the clocking pattern for the factory XJ, like on the factory 231, I might have some clearance problems on the floor pan. But the way this sits right now, this thing's clearing, and it actually fit and went in there pretty darn easy, really like confirming the fact that, man, this is a pretty straightforward swap. So it's in there and ready to go. However, there is one thing I noticed when I started to test fit my cross member and stuff. There's one thing I do need to show you. Okay, so here is the factory transmission mount that fits up against the bottom of the transmission here, and then up against the transfer case, holds up the exhaust, all that stuff. And I am finding one problem. Right here, it is contacting the top of this mount. So this kind of like bolt boss here on the transfer case is actually hitting the top of the mount here. Now that seems to be the only clearance issue. I found online some people complaining about how like the entire edge of this might have to be cut off for clearance. I'm only finding this one problem, but maybe there's slight differences between automatics versus manual transmissions versus Wrangler, Grand Cherokees. But as of right now, that seems to be my only issue. So I think what I'm going to do is just sort of cut a relief into the mount here so that I can get this thing to bolt up and actually sit up flush like it's supposed to. But other than that, I should be able to get everything this mounted up, get my cross member back on, and finish bolting this thing all together. Well, check it out. Our cross member is all bolted up. The transfer case is mounted in place, and we don't appear to have any other clearance issues. All the accessories are installed, and it looks like our transfer case swap is about complete. Now you can see where the final resting place of this transfer case is, and it clearly hangs a lot lower than the stock one does, but it's still relatively flush with the cross member, and I did test fit my skid plate, and it seems like it should still all clear, and I should be able to protect this thing and keep a relatively flat belly. But I mean, it's sitting a little bit lower than even the frame rails, so that is definitely something to be aware of when you're going to be doing this swap, at least on the Cherokee. Now if you check out all the linkage up in there, it is tight, but it did install all fairly easily. The adjustment wasn't too hard, and I think this thing's going to work pretty great. Check this out. Well, that should pretty much wrap up this transfer case swap. project, and I have to stress once again how really easy and straightforward this swap is. It just has a few little details and nuances that you might want to know before you dive into a project like this. And again, I would really appreciate for those of you that have any experience or any knowledge with this swap on any kind of Jeep model. I think it'd be great. Again, drop the comments down below. Like, help us out. I really do think it would be great to have like a good forum and a good conversation down in the comments so that anybody that has any questions about this swap can hopefully find answers. Now, before I go, I do think it's worth talking about the cost of this swap. So I am in it probably about $2,000, and that's including the case and the yokes and the shift kit and all that stuff like that. And so is this really worth it? Now, to me, having that 4-to-1 low range is, I think, a huge performance gain, and might be the biggest performance gain I'm doing in this whole axle swap process. I want to build a rock crawler, and having that low gearing is, I think, really important to me. So you can typically find these cases, like a JK one, for around $1,500. I got mine for $1,300. That was a couple years ago. And they pop up on the local forums, marketplaces, eBay, and you can find them actually fairly easy because they made a lot of JKs, so they're not too hard to find. The TJ ones are a little bit harder to find and are usually a little bit more expensive. I mean, $2,000 is pretty typical, so that's pretty expensive. But when you compare some of the other options, like an Atlas, the last time I checked, those things start for about $4K, so about double. And in a vehicle where I'm not running big V8 power, I'm not rock bouncing, I think this 241 is going to give me that low range that I wanted, the ease of install, and they're pretty strong for what they are. It's still a stock style transfer case too, which makes it very streetable as well, in my opinion. Now, you could also dig into the making a doubler or something like that. I don't have any experience doing that, but I know some of the donor transfer cases are, again, getting hard to find. They're getting more expensive and might not be as easy as an install. And so for me, this swap just makes a lot of sense. So if you liked the video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, leave a comment below, and consider subscribing to our channel if you haven't already. The trail plug, it is my plan to get this project done. I really hope this thing is seeing dirt by the summertime. So make sure that you are turning in, and until next time, we'll see you on the trail.